Some people only see what's in front of them. Others see the story behind it. Ethan Cole had always believed in power and control. As the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the world, he knew how to command attention, how to bend the world to his will. He was a man of few words, a man who never needed to ask for anything. Everything he wanted he took. But that was before he stepped off his private jet and into the small village where his life would change forever. Clara Hayes was not the kind of woman Ethan would typically notice. She wasn't a business mogul, nor was she in the social circles that he frequented. She was a single mom, living in a modest home just outside the village, raising her son with everything she had but little to give. Yet, she was exactly what Ethan needed without realizing it. That was the irony of life, how the most unexpected people often ended up being the ones who made the biggest impact. He first saw her at the village square. She was handing out food to a group of children. She didn't have much, but what she had she shared. Ethan had heard about her. Everyone in the village had. A single mom struggling but still managing to help others. Her kindness struck him like a punch to the gut. He was used to people wanting something from him, not giving it away freely. And yet here she was, giving with nothing expected in return. As he walked closer, his mind raced. Why did someone like her, someone with so little, act this way? There was a quiet power in her simplicity. Her smile, warm and genuine, disarmed him in a way nothing else could. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than they should have, before he composed himself and stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, a touch of curiosity in his tone. Clara looked up and for a second their eyes locked. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the lines of worry etched into her face. But there was something else too: strength, resilience, kindness. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the weariness in her tone. Ethan was taken aback. She was used to offering help, not receiving it. He had assumed she would at least ask who he was, what he wanted. But instead, she treated him like any other person. He didn't know whether to be impressed or irritated. He paused. What could he say to this woman? "I heard about you. About what you do here for the children." She shrugged, the weight of her world clearly on her shoulders. But she didn't seem to mind. "It's what I can do. They need help. I can offer it. What's more important than that?" Ethan stood there, speechless. He'd never been in a situation like this before. It wasn't just the way she spoke. It was her actions that had left an impression. She didn't need praise, didn't need recognition. Clara gave for the sake of giving. As he watched her walk away, Ethan felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was admiration, or maybe it was a sense of something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. It was impossible to deny. Clara Hayes had left a mark on him, and that, more than anything, terrified him. His life had always been about taking. But maybe, just maybe, this woman would teach him how to give. Ethan's mind raced as he watched Clara walk away, her silhouette framed by the soft golden light of the setting sun. There was something about her that unsettled him. It wasn't just her generosity, her willingness to give despite having so little. It was the quiet strength she radiated, the kind of strength that didn't shout for attention but simply existed. He had never been a man who needed or wanted anyone's approval. He had always taken what he wanted when he wanted it. But Clara Hayes was different. There was something about her that made him want to understand her, to know what made her tick. Something in her presence made him feel like he was looking at a version of himself that he had forgotten. The following day, Ethan found himself back in the village, more out of curiosity than anything else. He had a meeting with a potential investor in the morning, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Clara. He had to admit, there was an inexplicable pull, an attraction he couldn't shake off. This time, when he spotted her in the village square, she was talking to a group of children, handing out food and laughing with them as if their happiness mattered more than her own. She didn't look up when he approached. Ethan wasn't sure what to do. He had always been the one people sought after, never the other way around. "Do you always make time for others, even when you're struggling?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. The words just slipped out before he could stop them. He'd meant to ask something more casual, but there was an intensity in her presence that made him question his own intentions. Clara turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I have to. I don't have much, but I know how it feels to be hungry, to be alone. If I can make things a little better for someone else, then it's worth it. Ethan blinked, surprised by the simplicity and raw honesty in her words. He had always thought of people like her as weak, too soft, too naive to survive in a world like his. But now, standing here with her, he saw the strength in her softness. There was a quiet resilience that he couldn't ignore. Do you ever think about yourself? He asked a little too abruptly. He didn't mean for it to come out that way, but in that moment he needed to understand. Clara paused for a moment, her hands stilling as she considered his question. I think about my son. I think about the future. But I also know that if I don't give what I can now, then what's the point of having anything at all? Ethan stared at her, the words settling deep inside him. This woman, this single mom with barely enough to survive, had a perspective on life he hadn't even considered. She was a paradox, strong yet gentle, giving yet deserving of much more. It wasn't just her kindness that struck him, but the weight of her experiences that she carried so effortlessly. He didn't know it then, but that conversation marked the beginning of something that would change his life forever. Ethan didn't plan to return again, and yet by the third day, he was already walking the same narrow dirt path that led into the village square. It was just under half a mile from where his car was parked, but he chose to walk it anyway, as if the distance helped him think. Or maybe it helped him feel something he couldn't name. The air was different here. Slower. Honest. It didn't rush him, didn't demand anything from him. And for a man who had built his entire life on urgency, that felt unfamiliar. He found her near the small wooden table again, this time sorting through a few worn bags of groceries. There were fewer items than before. A loaf of bread, a small bag of rice, a few cans. Nothing extra. Nothing wasted. Clara didn't notice him at first, and Ethan didn't announce himself. He simply watched. The way she moved. The way she paused before setting something aside, as if calculating how far each item could stretch. It was not hesitation. It was care. A young boy approached her, smaller than the others, his clothes too thin for the breeze that had started to pick up. Clara looked at him once, then quietly reached into her bag. She took out the bread. Not a portion. The whole thing. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He stepped forward before he could stop himself. You are giving that away too? He asked. Clara turned, not startled, just aware. He needs it more, she said simply. Ethan glanced at the bag. And what about you? He pressed. She met his gaze, steady and calm. I will manage, she replied. There was no drama in her voice. No attempt to appear noble. Just truth. That unsettled him more than anything else. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, something he rarely did. It was a gesture he didn't control. You keep saying that, he said. Like it's enough. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him this time. It is enough, she said. Because I'm not alone. Ethan frowned. You barely have anything, he said. Clara nodded once. And yet I still have something to give, she answered. The words stayed in the air longer than expected. Ethan looked away first, toward the open space of the square, as if searching for something that would make her logic fail. It did not. He had built entire companies on the idea of more. More growth. More profit. More control. But standing here, watching a woman give away what little she had without hesitation, he realized something uncomfortable. More had never made him feel full. You think this is sustainable? He asked quietly. Clara smiled, not at the question, but at him. I think kindness always is, she said. Ethan let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. That isn't how the world works, he replied. Clara didn't argue. She simply looked at him, her expression soft but unshaken. Maybe not your world, she said gently. The distinction landed harder than any challenge he had faced in a boardroom. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't have an answer. He stood there, caught between two realities that refused to fit together. And somehow the one that made less sense on paper felt more real. Clara turned back to her table, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. But something had. Ethan felt it in the silence he carried with him as he stayed, longer than he intended. He had come to observe, to understand, but now he was beginning to question something deeper. Not who she was, but who he had become. Ethan's mind raced as he drove through the winding roads back to the village, his thoughts tangled in ways he couldn't explain. The image of Clara, standing by the small wooden table, giving what little she had without a second thought, kept replaying in his mind. His life had been built on precision, on taking on control. And yet here was a woman with nothing but a heart so full that it overflowed into the lives of others. He had been prepared to offer her a deal to change her life. But her simplicity, her quiet grace unsettled him. The next morning, he found himself at the same crossroads as before. He hadn't expected this. He didn't know what to expect. But he knew he had to see her again. And so, despite the logical part of his mind urging him to focus on business, he turned his car down the path that led to the village. The trees on either side of the road seemed to part, welcoming him. When he arrived, Clara was exactly where he had left her. In front of her small home, tending to her garden, her hands gentle on the soil. She didn't look up at first, not when he pulled in, not when he stepped out of his car. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice softer than he intended. Clara finally looked up. Her face softened into a quiet smile, a warm, genuine thing that made Ethan feel, for the briefest moment, like he had been home all along. "Morning," she replied simply, her voice as calm as ever. Ethan wasn't sure how to start. He had come with an intention, but now the words seemed to escape him. "You've been on my mind," he admitted, his tone almost hesitant. "I didn't expect you to make such an impression." Clara didn't seem surprised, nor did she comment on his words right away. She wiped her hands on her apron and motioned for him to sit on the porch. "You must be used to being in control of things," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But some things can't be controlled." Ethan frowned. He couldn't argue with that. He had spent his life trying to control everything. His company, his schedule, his world. And now here he was in a world that was too simple, too real for his own comfort. "I've spent my life thinking that I needed more," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "More success. More control." Clara didn't respond at once. She simply nodded, as if she understood something deeper than he did. Then, without warning, she stood and handed him a small bouquet of wildflowers from the garden. "Maybe," she said softly, "what you need most is peace." Ethan took the flowers, looking at them as if they were something precious, something he didn't know he needed. For a moment the silence between them felt comfortable, unspoken, but full of meaning. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice raw. "For everything." Clara smiled, her eyes sparkling with a quiet understanding. "I didn't give you anything," she said gently. "You already had it. You just needed to see it." And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift inside him. It was as though he had been blind to everything that truly mattered, and now with Clara's simplicity, her kindness, he was beginning to see what he had been missing all along. Ethan's mind was in turmoil as he left Clara's house. Her words had been simple, but they struck a chord deep within him. Peace. It was a word he hadn't truly understood until now. His life had always been filled with noise, meetings, decisions, deadlines. He thought that was what defined success, what defined him. But Clara's world was different. Her life wasn't marked by the constant chase for more. She lived in a quiet rhythm, one that wasn't defined by what she lacked, but by what she gave. The next few days were a blur of mixed emotions. Ethan found himself increasingly distracted by thoughts of Clara. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, toward the simplicity and warmth of her presence. And yet there was the other side of him, the part that reminded him of the world he came from, a world that demanded more from him every day. He couldn't help but question whether he belonged in Clara's world. She had a way of making him feel like he was a visitor in her life, an outsider who didn't quite fit. But he didn't want to be an outsider. Not anymore. It was late one evening when he found himself walking down the path to her house again. He had come here to the village many times before, but tonight felt different. There was a kind of urgency in his step, something he couldn't shake. He needed to talk to her. He needed to understand. When he reached her house, he saw her standing in the garden, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. She was crouched down, tending to the flowers, her hands moving with practiced ease as she worked. She looked peaceful, as though she didn't have a care in the world. And for a moment Ethan envied her. Clara looked up as she heard his footsteps, and a smile spread across her face. It was warm and genuine, the kind of smile that made everything feel right. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft. "You came back." He nodded, taking a step closer. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said," he admitted, his voice quiet. Clara stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't mean to make you think too much." "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "It's not that. I've been thinking about my life and what I've been chasing. I've been so focused on the wrong things." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And now?" He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "Now I want to find peace. Real peace. I want what you have, what you've shown me." His voice was filled with a sincerity that surprised even him. Clara's expression softened. She stepped forward. "Peace doesn't come from what we do or have. It comes from understanding who we are, and accepting it." Ethan felt something shift within him. The weight that had been pressing down on his chest seemed to lift just a little. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone in the world. Clara had given him more than just the flowers. She had given him a glimpse of something he didn't even know he needed. He reached out and took her hand, his voice low. "Thank you. For everything." Clara squeezed his hand, her smile growing warmer. "You're welcome. You just had to see it for yourself." Clara didn't pull her hand away immediately. But she didn't hold on either. There was a pause between them, small but meaningful. Like a quiet line neither of them wanted to cross too quickly. Ethan felt it. He loosened his grip, letting her hand slip gently from his, not out of rejection, but out of respect. The evening air had turned cooler. The soft glow of the fading sun stretched long shadows across the garden. For a moment everything felt still. Too still. "You shouldn't thank me yet," Clara said softly, her eyes steady on his. There was no accusation in her voice. But there was something else. Something heavier. Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her apron. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the edges like it had been handled more than once. She held it out to him. Ethan took it, confusion settling in his chest. As he unfolded it, his expression shifted. It was a printed article. His name was there. His company. His face. The headline spoke about the new development project. The one that would transform this entire region. The one that would bring profit, expansion, growth. The one that would quietly erase everything this village had been. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Slowly he looked up. Clara was watching him now, not with anger, but with something far more difficult to face. Disappointment. "You knew," he said, his voice low. Clara nodded once. "Not at first," she replied. "But people talk. And I listen." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the familiar gesture returning when control slipped. "I was going to explain," he said. "I just needed time." Clara gave a small, almost sad smile. "Time for what?" she asked. "To decide how much truth I deserved." The question landed quietly, but it cut deeper than anything louder could have. Ethan stepped forward instinctively. "It isn't like that," he said. Clara shook her head gently. "You walked into my world without telling me who you really are," she said. "You watched my life like it was something to study. And all this time you already had the power to change it completely." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Because she was right. And for the first time being right didn't feel like winning. "I didn't come here to hurt you," he finally said. Clara's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't step closer. "I know," she answered. "That is what makes it harder." The silence stretched again, heavier now, the kind that pressed against the chest. "You talk about peace," Clara continued, her voice steady but quiet. "But peace doesn't come from hiding the truth. It comes from standing in it." Ethan felt the weight of every decision he had ever made. Every deal. Every expansion. Every moment he chose profit over people. And now all of it stood between them. "I was going to change things," he said, though the words sounded weaker than he intended. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, as if searching for something beyond the surface. "Then why did you not start with honesty?" she asked. Ethan had no answer. Not one that mattered. The wind moved softly through the garden, rustling the leaves around them. Clara stepped back slightly, creating a space that hadn't been there before. "You aren't a bad man, Ethan," she said gently. "But you're a man who has always had choices. And right now you still do." Her eyes held his for one last moment. "The question isn't what you feel," she added. "It is what you're willing to change." And just like that, she turned and walked toward the house, leaving him standing there with the paper still in his hands. Ethan didn't follow. He could not. Because for the first time in his life, he realized something that no boardroom had ever taught him. Some things couldn't be negotiated. Some truths had to be faced alone. Ethan stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the fading sunset, the air growing colder as the sky darkened. His heart was heavier than it had ever been. He had seen Clara walk away, leaving him behind with nothing but the weight of her words and the paper in his hands. He hadn't moved. Couldn't move. For the first time, Ethan realized the depth of the consequences of his actions. Every deal, every decision he had made had always been about something bigger, bigger profits, bigger projects, bigger stakes. He had never paused to think about what really mattered, what really was worth fighting for. Clara's disappointment had cut deeper than anything else. His mind wandered back to the village, her village, the place where simplicity wasn't a weakness, where people lived by the bonds they created with one another, not the ones they signed in boardrooms. It had all seemed so distant to him, so foreign until now. Until he had met her. He hadn't expected to feel like this. He hadn't expected to care. But in those quiet moments when she smiled at him, when she handed him that plate of food, when she listened with empathy, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing. As the evening grew darker, he walked slowly to the house, his steps heavy, as though each one was a decision he couldn't undo. He reached the door and hesitated. He could go inside, tell himself he had done what he came here to do. He could justify it to himself, pretend it didn't matter. But Clara's face, her words, kept coming back to him. What had she said? The question isn't what you feel, it's what you're willing to change. The door was open. The house was quiet. But Ethan felt none of the comfort he usually did in a place like this. Instead, he felt the weight of a life he had never questioned. A life he had taken for granted. He sat at the kitchen table, the paper still in front of him, the plans for the development project scattered around. But today the plans seemed less important. The future seemed less certain. He knew now that this wasn't about the land or the development or even the money. This was about something deeper, something he had been avoiding his whole life. It was about change. About facing the truth, even if it meant giving up everything he thought he knew. Ethan looked at the paper one last time before he picked it up and folded it away. His decision had already been made. But the journey ahead was only beginning. And it wasn't going to be easy. He had to find a way to change, not just for Clara, but for himself. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when he had finally understood what was at stake. As he sat in the silence of the house, the wind gently tapping against the window, Ethan made a promise to himself. He would fix this. And somehow, in some way, he would make it right. He just didn't know how yet. Ethan stood by the window, gazing out at the soft glow of the streetlights in the distance. The quiet of the night was unsettling, a silence that mirrored the turmoil he felt inside. He had always been the man who made things happen, the one who took control, who made the decisions that shaped the world around him. But this was different. This wasn't about a business deal or an acquisition. This was about his heart. About a woman who had unknowingly broken down the walls he had spent years building around himself. The sound of Clara's voice echoed in his mind. "It's not about the money, Ethan. It's about what really matters." Her words had stung, but in the most unexpected way. They made him really think about what he had been chasing all these years. Success? Power? Control? What did they mean if they left him feeling hollow, disconnected, unable to see the beauty in the simple things she cherished? He turned away from the window and paced back to the table, where the plans for the new development sat untouched. He couldn't look at them anymore, not with the same drive he once had. The buildings, the infrastructure, the profits, they all felt meaningless now. Clara had shown him a different side of life. A side he hadn't known he longed for until she opened his eyes. It wasn't just her kindness or her strength that had captured him. It was her perspective, her understanding of what truly mattered. Clara had lived a life far removed from his world. A world where family, community, and love were the pillars that held everything together. He realized now that he had been living in a bubble, disconnected from those very things. But he couldn't undo the past. He couldn't change the decisions he had made, the path he had chosen. But he could choose a different future. A future where his actions were guided by something more than profit, where the relationships he built were genuine and meaningful. A future where Clara might stand beside him, not just as a fleeting moment, but as someone who truly mattered. Ethan knew he had to make things right. He couldn't just walk away from everything he had built, his company, his career, his legacy. But he could make changes, small ones at first, to live in a way that honored what he had learned from Clara. He could focus less on the bottom line and more on the people who made it all worth it. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The sound of the dial tone filled the room, but it didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like the first step in a new beginning. As the call connected, Ethan took a deep breath. It was time to start something new. And in that moment, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he was ready to face it, with Clara in his heart and a future he could build with his own hands. Ethan arrived just before sunset, the same hour he had stood there days ago feeling like an outsider in a world he didn't understand. Only this time he didn't come in a polished car or a pressed suit. He walked the half-mile dirt path again, his shoes gathering dust, his sleeves rolled up, his posture no longer rigid with control. The village looked the same, yet everything felt different. Or maybe it was him who had changed. Clara was near the garden, kneeling by the soil, her hands steady as she pressed small seedlings into the earth. She didn't notice him at first. Ethan paused a few feet away, not wanting to interrupt the quiet rhythm she had built for herself. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to announce his presence. He simply waited. When Clara finally looked up, her expression didn't shift into surprise. It settled somewhere between calm and cautious. "You came back," she said softly. Ethan nodded once. "I said I would make things right," he replied. His voice was steady, but there was no trace of the man who used to command rooms with a single sentence. Clara stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. "And did you?" she asked. There was no challenge in her tone, only truth. Ethan took a step closer, then stopped, respecting the space she had once placed between them. "The project is gone," he said. "Not delayed. Not redesigned. Gone." Clara studied him carefully, as if weighing not just his words, but the costs behind them. "You walked away from it?" she asked. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I chose something else," he said. The distinction mattered. He let the silence hold for a moment before continuing. "The land stays as it is, but the support doesn't disappear. I set up funding for the village. Schools, food programs, infrastructure that doesn't take anything away from what is already here." Clara's eyes softened, but she didn't step forward yet. "And what do you get in return?" she asked quietly. Ethan let out a slow breath, almost a smile, but gentler than before. "Nothing," he answered. Then he paused, correcting himself. "No, that isn't true. I get to live with a decision I'm not ashamed of." The wind moved softly between them, carrying the scent of earth and something growing. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and this time, there was no disappointment in her gaze. Only something careful. Something real. "You changed more than the project," she said. It was not a question. Ethan nodded. "You asked what I was willing to change," he replied. "I didn't know the answer then." His eyes met hers, steady and open. "Now I do." Clara took a small step closer. Not enough to erase the distance completely, but enough to shift it. "And what about you?" she asked. "Where do you go now?" Ethan glanced around the village, then back at her. "That depends," he said quietly. Clara raised her brows slightly, waiting. He didn't rush. For once he let the moment breathe. "I have spent my whole life building places I never stayed in," he said. "This might be the first one I want to stay." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than any promise he had ever made. Clara's lips curved into a small genuine smile. Not the kind she gave to everyone. This one was quieter. More personal. Staying isn't easy, she said. Ethan nodded. Neither is leaving, he replied. The honesty in his voice settled between them, steady and unguarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow across the garden, softening every edge. Clara reached down and picked up a small plant, its roots wrapped carefully in soil. She held it out to him. Ethan looked at it, then at her, understanding without needing explanation. He accepted it gently, holding it like something that mattered. It needs time, she said. And care. Ethan nodded, his fingers steady around the fragile stem. So do I, he answered. Clara's smile deepened just slightly. And this time when their eyes met, there was no distance left to measure. Only a quiet beginning neither of them needed to name. He had once believed he could build anything with enough power. But standing there, holding something that couldn't be rushed, he finally understood. Some things didn't grow because you forced them to. They grew because you stayed.